several reasons. First, she reminds us how male-dominated the vast majority of the genre was before her arrival. Beginning with Madame and Mademoiselle L'Espanaye in Poe's The Murders in the Rue Morgue, women usually appeared in mystery and suspense fiction as victims. To have women appear as deadly rather than dead was a giant leap forward in the genre. Second, the femme fatale opens up new territory for the genre by allowing both emotion in general and relations between men and women in particular to take center stage in mystery and suspense fiction in ways they hadn't done before. And as we all know, the battle of the sexes provides extremely fertile grounds for a whole range of emotions and actions, including jealousy, suspicion, envy, guilt, lust, rage, and occasionally murder. Third, if we're looking for a convenient way to describe the chasm that separates the hard-boiled mystery narrative from its classical analytical predecessor, we have only to consider the femme fatale, a figure that would have been literally inconceivable in earlier examples of the genre. Her centrality to the hard-boiled mystery speaks volumes about the defining qualities of that branch of the genre. Fourth, and finally, the femme fatale gives us an opportunity to remind ourselves that part of the reason mystery and suspense fiction has stuck around for so long is that it's extremely sensitive to and able to reflect changes in society. Specifically, the emergence of the femme fatale is connected to larger anxieties about the changing role of women in society over the course of the 20th century. How mystery and suspense fiction uses the femme fatale to narrate and respond to those changes will be just one of the stories we'll explore in this lecture. It's long been argued by readers and critics of the genre that the locus classicus of the emergence of the femme fatale is Dashiell Hammett's novel, The Maltese Falcon, and so that's where we'll begin. The character of Brigid O'Shaughnessy provides us with a list of definitional attributes of the femme fatale that will act as a standard against which we can judge female characters in later narratives. Based on Brigid, then, what do we know about the femme fatale? First, and most important, in terms of the impression that she makes on the male protagonist, she's beautiful. From the moment she walks into Sam Spade's office, both Spade and the reader are meant to be entranced by her beauty. Indeed, it's notable that Hammett, a notoriously spare, even stingy prose stylist, waxes positively rhapsodic about Brigid's face and body. He describes her with a level of detail he devotes to few other things in this novel. Second, she's deceptive. Brigid starts lying to Sam immediately and continues to do so throughout the novel. Being the experienced operative he is, Sam, of course, knows that she's lying. But Brigid lies with a frequency that borders on the compulsive, and Sam's inability to get her to be straight with him frustrates him enormously. Third, the femme fatale is both intelligent and ambitious. As the novel progresses, it becomes clear that Brigid will stop at nothing to make sure that she's the sole owner of the eponymous falcon, and she's come up with a complicated and devious plan that she hopes will ensure her success. It's worth noting that Brigid is also typical of the femme fatale in her ability to go toe-to-toe with a variety of violent and dominant men. She's not only smart, but also utterly ruthless, and it's this combination that makes her one of the most dangerous characters in a book filled with such characters. Remember that Caspar Gutman, no mean villain himself, warns Sam Spade about Brigid specifically. This is a tribute to how seriously Bridget in particular, and the femme fatale in general, should be taken. At this point, it's important to note that Sam is never taken in by Bridget. He knows immediately that she's lying to him and that she has a hidden agenda. If we ever had any doubts about this, they're laid to rest when Bridget gets down on her knees in front of Spade and begs for his help. Sam's response is to say she won't need much of anyone's help because she's so good at what she does. But just because Sam knows he's being played by Bridget doesn't mean that he's not susceptible to her charms. She is, after all, very beautiful, and no small degree of narrative suspense is generated by the fact that we can never be quite sure whether or not Sam is going to be able to resist her and do the right thing. In the end, of course, Sam does prove equal to the challenge that the femme fatale represents, and he turns Bridget over to the police, knowing that she faces either a long prison sentence or even possible execution. The point, however, is that giving up Bridget is an enormously difficult thing for Sam to do. This seemingly unemotional man is tormented by his decision to send Bridget over, precisely because there's a very real possibility that he loves her. In a long scene at the end of the novel, where Sam tries to explain to Bridget why he has to turn her in, it becomes clear that the femme fatale has shaken the private eye's personal and professional identity to the core. This fact alone is eloquent testimony to the power of this figure. And yet, the femme fatale is both powerful and powerless. Although she frequently dominates the narratives in which she appears, she ends those narratives either dead or at least punished. In other words, the power represented by the femme fatale has to be vanquished. But why? In order to answer this question, we must ask two related questions. What led to the rise of the femme fatale in mystery and suspense fiction in the 1920s? And why did this figure catch the public imagination to a degree that by the height of the film noir era in the 1940s and 1950s, the femme fatale had become a staple of the genre? The short answer to these complicated questions is that the period from the 1920s to the 1950s saw a sea change in assumptions about the meanings of womanhood and the roles that women play in modern society. Some of the highlights of this sea change include the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution in 1920, which gave women the right to vote, the move of millions of women into the paid labor force for the first time during the Second World War, and the research begun by Betty Friedan in the 1950s that eventually led to the publication of The Feminine Mystique in 1963. Research that indicated that many middle-class women were unhappy with being thought of only as wives and mothers. What does any of this have to do with mystery and suspense fiction? As women's roles in society changed in such a way that women gradually became more assertive, more powerful, and more publicly engaged in a wider range of social activities than ever before, it should come as no surprise that the way women appear in mystery and suspense fiction also changed. The rise of the femme fatale can be read as the genre's response to changes in women's status. No longer the silent victims, now they were demanding attention as equal opportunity seducers, blackmailers, and killers. Read against this background, we can see that the femme fatale represents a test for the male protagonist, usually a private eye, but a test of a particular kind. We have become used to the idea that detectives like Auguste Dupin and Sherlock Holmes have to reject emotion in general and emotional attachment to women in particular in order to exercise their analytical and intellectual gifts, effectively. But exactly the same turns out to be true for the very different figure of the private eye. Sam can't allow himself to love Bridget because that will mean that he's weak and susceptible to being influenced, that is, fooled, by others. Bridget and femme fatales like her must be punished before they destroy the isolation of the private eye hero, an isolation that the reader realizes is both necessary to the private eye and somewhat tragic, in the sense that it signifies the private eye's inability or unwillingness to form emotional attachments with others. In the battle of the sexes, there can only be one winner. If we now turn to Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, we can see another example of the test that the femme fatale represents for the private eye. In this novel, Chandler rather cleverly evolves the femme fatale figure by splitting her into two separate characters, the sisters Carmen and Vivian Sternwood. On the one hand, Carmen represents the purely dangerous side of the femme fatale who threatens the private eye's life. Although she's beautiful and at least tries to be seductive, she doesn't possess the intelligence that defines the true femme fatale, and Marlowe is never seriously tempted by her. On the other hand, there is Vivian, who has the intelligence, sophistication, and seductiveness that Marlowe finds appealing. She's also ruthless enough to be a source of at least indirect danger to Marlowe. But although he goes as far as to kiss Vivian, and even allows that he enjoys it, by and large, Marlowe is immune to her charms. So, the Sternwood sisters never present the same kind of tormenting challenge to Marlowe that Bridget does to Sam. Why is this? Many critics have remarked that Marlowe is meant to personify the chivalric values of the medieval knight in a modern era that has no time for those values. His inevitably quixotic quest to maintain some degree of integrity in the midst of pervasive corruption defines both his character and the narratives in which he appears. This becomes particularly clear if we study his relationships with women. If we were to pursue the train of thought that sees Marlowe as the modern incarnation of the medieval knight, then we might expect that the Sternwood sisters are damsels in distress whom the knight rescues. In fact, it would be much more accurate to describe Carmen and Vivian as the dragons that the knight must fight and defeat, because they're determined to prevent Marlowe from fulfilling his quest, not by burning him to a crisp, but by seducing him, and in doing so, making him forget his true knightly purpose. As we've seen, Marlowe is able to triumph over the sisters, not only because he stays true to his code of professional ethics, but also because he's loyal to General Sternwood, the sisters' father. In this scenario, Sternwood is not only Marlowe's client, but also the lord to whom Marlowe owes allegiance. It doesn't matter that the general is neither heroic nor particularly admirable. As is typical of Chandler's work, relationships between men are more meaningful than those between men and women. Ironically, however, in The Big Sleep, it's precisely Marlowe's loyalty to the general that allows the femme fatales of the narrative to go unpunished, relatively speaking. Even though Carmen has killed one man and also tried to kill Marlowe, she's allowed to receive medical treatment rather than being arrested. As for Vivian, although she covered up the fact her sister murdered her husband, Marlowe lets her off the hook because he doesn't want the general to find out exactly how rotten his daughters are. In the hard-boiled world, loyalty often comes at a price, and here it involves sacrificing justice. So far, we've looked at examples of femme fatales who represent a source of temptation the male protagonist must fight against. In some cases, however, the male protagonist doesn't resist at all, but rushes willingly into the femme fatale's arms, as we'll see if we now turn to James M. Cain's 1943 novel, Double Indemnity. Before looking at the consequences of such a rash decision, let's remind ourselves of exactly what a femme fatale is, because there are many women in mystery and suspense fiction who seem to fit the bill, but who must ultimately be rejected as pretenders to the crown. The novels of Philadelphia crime writer David Goodis, for example, are filled with strong, sexually dominant women. But they aren't femme fatales because they're cunning rather than intelligent, and because their ambition only extends as far as dominating the man in front of them. In a similar vein, The Bride Wore Black, a 1940 novel by the master suspense novelist Cornell Woolrich, features a literal femme fatale in the form of a woman who tracks down and kills a group of men that she is convinced are responsible for the death of her husband on their wedding day. But there's nothing seductive about her, and Woolrich is more or less silent on the subject of her looks. The ideal femme fatale must have all the following qualities: beauty, ambition, intelligence, deceptiveness, and ruthlessness. James M. Cain's Phyllis Nerdlinger possesses all of these in abundance, and that is why she's able to draw insurance salesman Walter Huff into her plan so easily. It's also why Phyllis, along with Bridget, is the most famous femme fatale in the genre. With that said, it's probably more accurate to say that Billy Wilder's film version of Phyllis Dietrichson, Barbara Stanwyck, and Walter Neff, Fred McMurray, are even more famous than Cain's characters. And so I'll focus on Wilder's versions of these characters before coming back to Cain's originals to point out some instructive contrasts between the two versions. When Walter first meets Phyllis, murder is the last thing on his mind. But almost before he knows what's happening, he finds himself agreeing to participate with Phyllis in a plot to murder her husband so that they can collect the insurance money, even though his immediate reaction when Phyllis first hints at this possibility is to reject the idea vehemently. So how did Phyllis win Walter over? Partly because Walter didn't need much persuading. It turns out that Walter has been thinking for years of pulling off the perfect insurance fraud, and Phyllis gives him the opportunity to make his dream a reality. But let's not sell Phyllis short. Walter also comes round to her way of thinking, thanks in no small part to her seductive powers. As in The Maltese Falcon, for much of Double Indemnity, it looks as if the femme fatale might be taking the male protagonist for a ride. Just as Sam is eventually able to summon up the intestinal fortitude to send Bridget over, however, so Walter is able to do the same to Phyllis. In fact, at least in Wilder's film version, Walter goes a big step further, shooting and killing Phyllis even after she spares him when she realizes that she loves him. Incidentally, part of the reason I worship this film is because it contains my favorite definition of love, which effectively goes as follows: I realized I loved you when I couldn't shoot you a second time. Phyllis's death at the end of Double Indemnity is a clear example of the brutally efficient dispatching of the femme fatale at the end of a narrative. The fact that Walter survives their climactic encounter, at least temporarily, implies that the femme fatale must be punished, perhaps precisely because of some of the qualities that define her: intelligence, ruthlessness, and ambition. Qualities that are admired in a man, especially in the context of mystery and suspense fiction, but that provoke anxiety, suspicion, and fear when they're found in a woman. This is the point at which it's important to return to Kane's novel to note and explain the differences between Kane's vision and that of Billy Wilder. Kane's novel also ends with Phyllis's death, but under very different circumstances. Rather than being killed by Walter, Phyllis and Walter escape to Mexico on a ship. When they reach the conclusion that their pseudonyms won't save them from eventual capture, they decide to commit suicide by leaping overboard. There's a big difference between the femme fatale being killed by her male lover who survives and the femme fatale committing suicide along with her lover. Punishment is the keynote of the first fate, while control and choice dominate the latter fate. Not to mention the fact that Kane's Phyllis also happens to have a psychopathic attachment to death and dresses and makes herself up to resemble her vision of death before she kills herself. All of which suggests that Kane's version of Phyllis is much more flamboyant and extreme than anything in Wilder. How can we explain the difference between the two versions of Double Indemnity and the different fates they have in store for their respective femme fatales? My prime suspect in answering this question is Raymond Chandler, who was notoriously critical of Kane's work, dismissing it as sensationalist, vulgar, and trashy. Chandler wrote the screenplay along with Wilder for the film version of Kane's novel. Chandler must have relished the opportunity to remake Kane's work in his own image, and the changes he made are instructive. Walter's boss, Barton Keyes, is promoted from a relatively minor role in the novel to a major role in the film, to the point where he's arguably even more important to Walter than Phyllis. After all, when Walter kills Phyllis, he could escape immediately. But instead, he comes back to his insurance office to record a confession addressed to Keyes, perhaps because he feels guilty about deceiving him. Tellingly, his murder of Phyllis doesn't seem to bother Walter at all. But the most important change Chandler made to Kane's novel is one we've already discussed. Phyllis is not allowed to choose the manner of her own death, but is instead executed by Walter after he effectively passes sentence on her by saying, "We're both rotten, only you're a little more rotten." This outcome illustrates not only Chandler's own moralism, but also the widespread belief that the defeat or death of the femme fatale is the only appropriate fate for this figure in a mystery and suspense narrative. That's why, although part of me is sympathetic to this line of thinking, I've always been unconvinced by the argument that the femme fatale should be read as a proto-feminist figure contemporary women should identify with. While it's undoubtedly true that the femme fatale's intelligence and creativity set her apart from her female foremothers in the genre, the fact that she's usually punished for these very same qualities obviously indicates the limits of this figure and the limits of women's role in hard-boiled crime narratives. So what happens to the figure of the femme fatale once the golden years of hard-boiled mystery fiction begin to recede into the past? Does the figure fade away entirely, or does she just change shape? One way of answering this question is to ask another question that will initially sound very strange. Where is the homme fatale? In other words, if we need a term like femme fatale to describe a type of woman who is ruthless and violent, why don't we have an equivalent term for ruthless and violent men in mystery and suspense fiction? The answer, of course, is that men in the genre are expected to be ruthless and violent. In fact, we're surprised if we come across a man who does not possess these qualities. This renders the category of homme fatale both unnecessary and even slightly ridiculous, a fact that sheds much light on the assumptions that mystery and suspense fiction makes about what constitutes a typical and ordinary man. Although we're familiar with the ways in which the femme fatale violates conventional expectations about femininity, it's also possible that the absence of the homme fatale speaks to the genre's conventional assumptions about manhood. But what does the absence or irrelevance of the homme fatale have to do with the fate of the femme fatale? Just this. If mystery and suspense fiction always assumed that the nature of men was to be violent, then the longer the figure of the femme fatale was around and the more established it became, the more those same assumptions about violence also came to be applied to women. I don't want to imply that we've now reached a stage where the murderer in any given piece of mystery and suspense fiction is just as likely to be a woman. This would be a flagrant violation of the facts of real life, where men still commit the vast majority of violent crimes. But what I am saying is that the line between the categories of femme fatale and woman is now sufficiently blurred that the former category has come to seem not only unnecessary, but also somewhat quaint, even antiquated, a reminder of a time when violent women were still unthinkable. Appropriately then, if we want to find femme fatales in more recent mystery and suspense fiction, the best place to look is in retro examples of the genre, which often revisit earlier periods in imitation, homage, or reworking of a particular writer or tradition. An especially fine and relevant example of this trend is Megan Abbott's 2007 novel, Queenpin, one of a series of novels that Abbott wrote during the first stage of her career, in which she revisited and reworked the tropes of classic noir narratives from the 1940s and 1950s. As the title Queenpin suggests, Abbott goes back to the noir novel and asks what female power might look like if we begin with the category of the femme fatale and then think beyond it. The answer she comes up with is the character of Gloria Denton, the queenpin of the title, a former gun moll who has risen to a position of influence in the mob by virtue of her experience and ruthlessness. Denton attracts the attention of the unnamed narrator, a young woman just starting out in Vegas who regards Denton as a role model, mother figure, and icon all rolled into one. The novel tells the story of the increasingly complicated relationship between these two women as their initially productive and frictionless mentor and mentee relationship becomes more violent and conflictual as the pupil wants to replace rather than merely emulate the teacher. Abbott succeeds in exposing the limits of the femme fatale as conventionally conceived, while simultaneously expanding the range of this character type. Interestingly, she does so by making the relationship the center of her narrative between two women, rather than between a man and a woman, or, a la Chandler, between two men. In doing so, Abbott reveals how new life can be breathed into old archetypes by adjusting the gender dynamics that power and organize mystery and suspense narratives, dynamics that may be so taken for granted that we don't even realize they exist until a novel like Queenpin makes us see them as if for the first time. Despite Abbott's success in Queenpin, the novel's 1950s setting implies that the femme fatale can be reworked in its original temporal context, but bringing this figure into the present day is a very different matter. This difficulty is addressed humorously in Christopher Nolan's classic 2000 film Memento, which can be described as a contemporary noir narrative. Memento tells the story of Leonard Shelby, a former insurance investigator, perhaps a nod to Double Indemnity's Walter Huff, who suffers from anterograde amnesia, which means he can't make new memories. He was attacked during a home invasion in which his wife was raped and murdered. Believing the police investigation was flawed, Leonard has taken it upon himself to investigate his wife's death and bring the murderer to justice. In the process of his investigation, he meets a woman by the name of Natalie, who on the surface has all the attributes that we identify with the femme fatale. She's beautiful, cunning, intelligent, and ruthless. Natalie takes advantage of Leonard's disability to advance her own agenda in a most unpleasant way. She insults Leonard's dead wife to his face, angering him to the point that he beats her, and then relies on the fact that Leonard will forget what he's done so that she can set someone else up for the beating and have Leonard punish them. Though Natalie clearly meets the criteria, whenever I teach Memento and I ask my students straight out whether Natalie is a femme fatale, they hesitate. Why? Partly because they associate that figure with a certain time period, not to mention with black and white movies, and so they're reluctant to acknowledge that the femme fatale is alive and well today. But the other reason Natalie doesn't seem like a femme fatale to my students is that she can't seduce Leonard. Why not? Here's where the humor comes in. Even though Natalie knows Leonard has anterograde amnesia, she still believes that she's so beautiful, so seductive, that Leonard will remember her when they meet. When Leonard insists that in fact he won't remember her, Natalie simply kisses him and says, "I think he will." When they meet next, Leonard, of course, doesn't remember Natalie, and Natalie is clearly upset about it. The joke is on Natalie, but it's a joke that works on two levels. Not only has she overestimated her own seductive powers, but she's also ignored the fact that the femme fatale has become a slippery category in the 21st century. In another lecture, we will see that women's roles in mystery and suspense fiction extend far beyond being either the victim or the femme fatale. Memento, however, reminds us that the femme fatale can be an empowering identity for women to take on, but that it also has very definite limits.